Hey, welcome back. Today I'm in studio with Brian Nugent. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, Brian is the Assistant Chief of the Avon Police Department here in Indiana. And so I've known Brian for several years. He's got a really interesting background, but today he's going to come and share a couple stories with us. One being one of mentoring a young man who ironically ended up in the HVAC field in the end. But a great story overall of mentorship, second chances, and those types of things. So we're going to get into that, so stick with us. All right, so this story of mentoring, it's really phenomenal. I've had, obviously, the pleasure of knowing you and knowing about this from its inception. It's reached a ton of outlets across the nation, and you've gotten a ton of coverage on it. So can you kind of just start with the beginning and walk us through how this started and kind of the path along the way of the story?
Yeah, it's really kind of a unique story that as I found myself being a part of it, I kind of realized this is probably never going to happen again.
Once in a lifetime thing.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, for me, it was something I just felt like there was a deeper purpose to it, and so I was happy to do that. But kind of bring everybody up to speed, what happened is back in 2013, I was working as a detective with our agency. And as we would in a smaller agency, we would respond to everything. We weren't just limited to crimes against persons or property. And I got called out to an armed robbery about 1 o'clock in the morning in January of 2013.
Now, for full context, though, Avon is the border, the western border of Indianapolis.
Yep.
So literally on the line, the road, you have Indianapolis here, you cross the stoplight, you're in Avon.
Yeah.
So you serve about a population of 30,000, but you have a lot when it comes to crime of crossover issues. Is that correct?
Yeah, so a lot of transient population.
Okay.
People driving to and from Indianapolis. And we're talking, the location of this robbery was probably about 30 to 40 feet away from the city of Indianapolis in Marion County.
Or the county line, as people call it. Yeah,
exactly. Okay. So we had responded out to this location. It was a little restaurant. We actually responded to that scene, processed the scene really like anything else we ever did, right? You had everything from your canine partners, your uniformed officers out there that night. Picked the case up the next day, just started piecing it together, and fortunately we were able to identify two individuals that kind of were conspiring to do this robbery. And one of those individuals, a young man by the name of Ramil Pitamber. And Ramil ended up identifying himself as a person that had the weapon and actually did the robbery. And it was just a really kind of a standard case, to be quite honest with you, back in 2013. And it would be years later that he and I would cross paths again, and then that's kind of how this mentorship kind of started. Okay. So it's a pretty cool story in terms of what it was. He was actually sentenced to prison for about 11 years, and he got out early with some good behavior, some educational credits. And I just happened to be on a Sunday afternoon. I left from church with my family, my wife and 3 kiddos. And we're literally, just transitioning through our Sunday afternoon, and I go to Goodwill, and I go to the Goodwill stop to drop off stuff like we all do, right?
Sure.
You're done with this
Pull around back.
Yep, absolutely. And I did that. I pulled up back, and a gentleman came to the vehicle, and initially I didn't really recognize him. And I just kind of had the moment where I just thought, this guy's going to ask my name, he's going to ask me some questions, and as we started navigating that, he told me that he recognized me and asked me if my name was Brian, and I did. And it was in that moment that I realized that this was Ramil Pitamber right there in front of me.
Sure.
So from there, he had made an offer, or an ask actually, of me to be a part of a communication with him and asking if we could get together for coffee. And it was a very weird moment, to say the least, but I'm really glad that I did, because from that moment till today, we've had a good relationship and really helped him through a lot of adversities.
Okay, so fast forward 11 years, you send someone to prison for robbery.
Yeah.
It sounds like it was a pretty quick case. You said you had them identified by the next day.
Yeah.
11 years later, dropping some items off at the Goodwill, he sees you, and he comes and says, hey, I want to meet with you. What's your first thought? Like, where is this going?
You know, it was so bizarre. I don't know that I have much memory about what that engagement was like. I do remember I had my oldest daughter with me, and she was in the vehicle. And I remember he had asked me if I was Brian. I said yes. He asked me how I was doing, and he actually just gave me a big old hug. just right there in the Goodwill. So I recognized who he was at that moment. But talk about when these two sort of cultures collide, right? My personal life and my professional life kind of starting to touch with my daughter sitting right there.
Yeah, that had to be a type of what's going to happen here moment for you.
It was a little weird, but at the same time, you know, he was very respectful, he was very kind, and I knew that it took a lot of courage for that young man to identify himself and tell me, you know, hey, here's who I am, do you remember me?
Sure.
And as I left from the Goodwill, I remember I stopped and I was trying to explain to my daughter, I think she was like 8 years old at the time, how I knew this gentleman, and I was overcome with emotion because I had really kind of felt that, you know, I don't think that I would have had the courage, you know, if you would, to be able to go out there and do that. So really proud of him for asking for help.
He's about how old at the time then?
At the time, let's see, I think he would have came out when he was 19 when he first came out. Obviously, he was a high school age student, attended here on the west side of Indianapolis. Obviously, it disrupted his graduation and all of that sort of timeline in his life. So when he came out of prison, he didn't have a driver's license. He obviously had a felony conviction on his criminal history, which, as I learned, was such a hardship for him to even find housing. You know, you go to an apartment complex and you have to fill out the application. He was denied what many of us would consider appropriate housing accommodation just because he had a conviction. And so I felt like I was dealing with a young man who had made some regrets as a young kiddo, and I was just trying to think to myself, you know, I don't know that I've found myself having the courage to look at people and just say, will you help me? Sure. And I was just really taken back by that, and I thought the biggest fool would be myself if I were to turn away from that young man. So I'm really glad that I did. We really had a good relationship for several years, and we still stay in touch today.
So, so this starts out, you run into him, he's like, hey, you want to meet for coffee or whatnot. You drive home, you're processing that. Where did it kind of go? What was the next step after that?
So we got together, we had lunch one day, kind of not knowing what to expect. I went back to his file, I printed off his photograph that we had taken the night we took him into custody. Kind of was prepared for either side of this. He obviously didn't seem to be upset or angered with me, but there was some apprehension, not knowing where this was going to go, obviously.
The unknown.
Just kind of the anxiety of that, right? So I remember sat down with him about 20 minutes into it. He just said, you know, it's really weird to sit here and talk to you today. I thought, well, me too, right? It's just kind of a situation you're not used to. So with that being the case, I had a really good conversation. We had dinner. And I just pulled out the photograph of him, and I just sat it down in front of him, and I said, you know, when you look at this picture, what do you see? And it was in that moment that he grew very silent. He stared at it and got a little teary-eyed and said, I just see a lost kid. And I have to reflect on, you know, what I knew of him at the time we arrested him. Very little about his background, if you would. But he really started to open up about his childhood and some just horrific things that he had to endure. Things that in the family, we're talking victimization at many different levels. And I just kind of realized to myself that, you know, a kid in his position at that age was very vulnerable to a lot of different things. And the last thing I really wanted to see was him to come out, ask for help, and then fall victim to the recidivism rate where people reoffend and go back to prison. And so I thought, you know, maybe I have the opportunity to make a difference, and I'm really glad that I did. He's doing really well for himself right now, and I'm proud of that.
So a lot of times in our foundations class, I tell people that the hardest conversation to have is the ones we have in the mirror. They're many a times the most productive, but the hardest to start. And it sounds to me like he had a few of those before you pulled into the Goodwill drive-in that day.
I mean, courageous conversations, right? That's the threshold that I think that many of us try to avoid at times because they're also uncomfortable. And to know that he had no idea that I was going to be there that day, to not have an expectation that I was going to be, you know, my demeanor, it just really told me that it was top of mind to him, that he was ready and willing to engage and ask for help from anybody who was genuinely looking to help him. And I can reflect on many times in my life, both personally and professionally, where I kind of almost felt the cowardice of asking for help. And that kind of almost shamed me at times. But as much as I think that I may have helped Ramil over the years, he's helped sharpen me, both as a parent, as a police officer, as a husband, and just as a man overall. It's made me better as well.
So you have this conversation with him. You can realize it sounds like he's very sincere. I'm sure you're kind of processing the irony of just showing up, you know, and I tell people a lot of times I think everything, you know, always happens for a reason. But someone once also told me that luck is where preparation and opportunity meet. So in his own mind, it sounds to me like, he'd had those conversations in the mirror, he's prepared, you show up there, he identifies, and we'll get to kind of, how everything went that way, but I'm guessing you treated him in a way when you dealt with him that he felt comfortable enough to come back and be vulnerable to you and ask for that help. Because I highly doubt he would have had that not been the case, and so I'm sure there's conversations about that. So you're processing this, you decide, I'm going to give it a whirl, and you get back with him. How does it kind of go from there then?
It's interesting because at the time that we had met, he had just started a Goodwill, right? So this is an opportunity for him to kind of start earning a paycheck, living within an employment circumstance. And it was during that time frame, he was still trying to figure out, what am I going to do next, right? His biggest hurdle was, how do I find a decent job that will not only do a good pay scale for himself, but also to give him an opportunity to move and grow into a profession. And for me, that first conversation that we had, I asked him, I said, well, what are your interests? Like, what do you realize you want to do? And he communicated some HVAC work. He talked a little bit about electrical work in general. And as we continued to have that discussion, I realized, well, the first thing we have to do is get you ready for job interviews. And what are those going to look like? So it was kind of, we've had some humorous conversations about this topic because, as you can tell, I'm pretty high fashion over here. So we talked a little bit about...
It's a police thing.
Absolutely it is. We talked at length about just how to dress. That's something that these young men and women that have an absence in their homes in terms of parents or stable figures in their lives, how do you navigate that? How do I dress, right? So we talked about conservative colors. We talked about not having prints on your shirt that might, kind of detract from your character. And so we talked about, hey, you're working at Goodwill. When you clock out, go back in there and look for a nice button-down shirt. Do you tuck the shirt in? What sort of, conversations do you have when you're looking in the mirror saying, do I look like somebody who would want to hire me and give me that opportunity? He never had that. And that was very front and center to me when we had our conversations. Was he's never had anybody sit down and say, how do I even answer questions about character or integrity? And so as we started to kind of go through that journey, we had a lot of laughs. He didn't have his driver's license, so I recall one night we had a grocery store here in Avon that he actually showed up with his grandmother in the car. And I ended up coming around 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night. I jumped in the car and taught him how to parallel park so he could go past his driver's ed class, right? Like, when's the last time any of us have had to really parallel park, right? So it was little things like that we had a lot of fun. And as that kind of happened, organically, we just kind of found ourselves caring more for each other. How are you doing this weekend? Or, hey, have a good Christmas, or safe travels, and just starting a friendship like most people would. But obviously from a very unique circumstance in the sense of where he came from. So for probably months on end, I'd say probably about once a month we would meet up. I did set a couple guidelines down and said, look, we're going to talk face to face. We're not just going to do the texting thing, which we're all kind of desensitized to. I wanted to hear his tone. I wanted to see his face. I kind of wanted to see how he was interacting with people. And over the course of the next couple of years, I was just astounded. You see his confidence raised in what he would do and how he would speak. Really just started to kind of hone in on the many things that I was seeing unfold between the two of us, his maturity. He'd call me and talk to me about, how do I handle the workplace conflict? Being mixed race, he not only is Pakistani, but he's also African American. So when you took together all these sort of workplace hardships, this is at the time he went into prison, he was 16 years old. By the time he came out, he was a grown man. He's never had to deal with those sort of adversities like, hey, I've got a supervisor or a boss that I think's treating me differently, and I can't help but think that it's racially oriented. So we would just talk those conversations out. And after a period of time, I realized, that some of these conflicts are different, but some of them are very consistent with what I would see in my workplace. I might have a conflict with you, and I'm talking to a friend, and I'm saying, why is Aaron saying this stuff? Why would he think that? What have I done to give him reason? And I think that self-reflection is what really kind of put him as a force multiplier in his own development, just being a good employee and learning how to handle those.
He had a high level of awareness, it sounds like,
very
from
much
himself, because to identify not only that's going on in the system, but the need to have the skills to address that and do it in an effective manner. I mean, that's stuff that we teach all the time. A lot of times I say leadership and parenting in theory are very similar because you're going out with the objective of taking a person, trying to help them know what they don't know, first and foremost, trying to help them learn the things that they need, educate them, and get them to the next level and see them succeed. Many times we want to utilize our own successes and failures to keep them from failing, but sometimes they need to do it on their own to see. So I'm seeing a lot of similarity in that and within this, and so it seems like this morphed into almost like an organic Big Brother program.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And I think that's the interesting perspective you have, Aaron, because a lot of times through this relationship with Ramil, I really kind of felt like there was that father-son, that mentor-mentee relationship from a very early age. One small fragment about his personal life story is that he lost his father at a very young age. And there was a lot of issues and struggles that he had with his relationship with his father. But the more that he and I would talk, and the more that we would trust, and the more that we would ask of each other, we really found ourselves seeing exactly what you're talking about. It was very much a parenting sort of paradigm that we had, and he just did so remarkable with being aware of things. And there were nights and days where he would be involved in the wrong crowd, and I would call him, and those conversations didn't go very well. For me, what are you doing at this bar at 1 in the morning? What is inside that bar that's going to help you achieve the goals that you have set for yourself? And so there's some tough love moments for sure, but I think the big thing as a parent and as a mentor with Ramil was just trying to get people to understand the value of critical thinking. Right? I can't necessarily give you the answer to every conflict you're going to have, but if I give you the framework, if I give you the structure, if I give you the kind of the principles of what
tools.
Exactly. That's what we're trying to navigate. And from there, the phone calls and the meetups for lunch really started to evolve into, well, here's a conflict that I had, here's how I handled it, here's how it resulted. And I just thought to myself, good job. It really was applying things and was showing a demonstrated ability, if you would, of conflict resolution.
How's that, so being an assistant chief of a police department, how is that similar or different to how you run an organization currently?
It's very similar. I would say it's more similar than it is dissimilar. Right? I think for the most part, we're bringing in young individuals who are still learning a skill set. When officers first come into the agency, we're having to teach them about case reports and computer this and fancy equipment that. And that's a part of that, but we're also trying to teach and educate them and prepare them for what the law enforcement culture looks like. What's it like to be out in public and to wear a uniform, and when someone opens up the door, you're going to have to get used to the fact that people might stare at you. And some people might stare in admiration, some people might even stare at you with some hatred, but how do you navigate that?
Some might yell at you.
And some might yell, or they wave without all 5 fingers.
Right, that happens.
Every once in a while. So it is very similar in the sense of you're going to be immersed in a culture, you're going to be immersed in conflict, here's the expectation of how to handle that. And I think the process of managing expectations and setting expectations and being prepared not only for the successes and how they handle that, but also for the failures. And if we can mitigate those failures, whether it's in the law enforcement or in a mentor-mentee's relationship, I think our real overall goal is to just mitigate as best as we can. Hope that they learn from our mistakes as part of that sort of mitigation plan, but also just having the ability to reflect on it and say, as an officer, I just want to make sure you don't get hurt, right? And Ramil's situation was, I want to make sure you don't get another arrest, right? So how do we avoid those sort of extreme projections that we're hoping to navigate away from? But very, very similar in many of those different ways.
And it sounds like too, in the workplace we have rules, regulations, general orders, those types of things, SOPs. You in this situation had to identify some boundaries as well, you said?
Very much so. I had a lot of apprehension about what those boundaries would look like in the coming years and months, but I knew that some of the very first boundaries that we had to set were those expectations, right? A little bit of a difference in the expectation side versus the boundaries, but at the same time, I needed him to know that this was not something that I was just going to do by a text message once a week. Or, I'll see you in 2 months, right? It was going to be very regular, because my anticipation was that with more regularity of communication, that there was a higher chance for his success, right? And so yes, he had probation and parole meetings to go to, and that's a part of that.
Right.
But who could he sit down and talk to about conflicts that weren't just asking him about drug use or genuine encounters with law enforcement? Just trying to take it to that more, I'll call it, maybe it's a more of an informal level of a communication. But I know that's what he really needed. And a lot of people that seek that mentorship don't have the courage to look at you and say, hey, I'm new in this job or I'm new in this role. Teach me what you wish somebody would have taught me then. That's where I think that the void is at for a lot of people.
Yeah. Now, this is an awesome story. I appreciate you coming in and sharing it today.
Yeah.
And it was so ironic to me too that he ends up, he's an HVAC tech for a while. This is kind of went on now. You said started in 20 what?
So his arrest would have been in 2013, and then we actually connected in 2017. So he had 4.5 years after he got out.
Gotcha. So in the almost 7 years now that this has been going on, kind of where are you guys at now?
So as we were sitting here today, he has moved to Arizona.
Okay.
He's been doing some truck driving. He got a CDL.
Oh, wow.
He really kind of felt like he needed a climate change, not just necessarily, figuratively speaking.
But I can't blame him there.
I know. It's like you just come through the rain and snow some days up here. But in Arizona, he's doing really well.
Okay.
And I think for him, to have a change of scenery was what he really needed in a couple different ways. He had a lot of media attention here in Indianapolis for what had happened, and he was always very happy to talk about his story. When we would speak in front of a group of people, he a lot of times would go into the details that didn't make the CBS National News story or didn't make the Indianapolis News Network. And those are very vulnerable conversations that he has with people that he's never met. And so I think it got to the point with him, he did HVAC for a little while, he did electrical work for a little while, he started doing some driving here in central Indiana. And the opportunity just led to a better opportunity out west. And so I just messaged him last week. He messaged me back talking about speaking at a Citizens Police Academy here in Avon here in a couple months. And so working all the logistics for him to be there. In that class, we actually shared the story about the robbery, but also the story about how we've become friends. Yeah. So it's been a very unique situation for both of us, and one that I'm very proud of and proud of him for.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I love the fact that you prepared him, you helped him, kind of coached him get into one career that then led to another, that he was, just kind of really accelerating himself. Yeah. And so he has those tools to be adaptive and figure out where he wants to go next, and it sounds like he's really still driven to do that. Yeah. So as you look back on that, and you guys were doing a lot of speaking engagements locally, nationally, he's sharing his story. You talk about being very vulnerable, which I completely understand and identify with. What type of feedback would you get from other people once he shares his story? Because one of the things I've found is that invites other people to not only feel more comfortable, but realize I'm not so different. We all have a story, and then sometimes it invites them to share theirs.
No, and that's a great way to put it. Whenever he was actually speak at different locations, we've spoken together at police camps, we've spoken together at correctional facilities, we've spoken at other citizens academies. He's actually flown down to Baton Rouge, Louisiana to actually speak at a summit that a federal funded grant facilitated for people all around Baton Rouge to have a conversation with. So being there, and every time he would share that story, it's a really awesome opportunity for me to kind of stand back, and when he's done speaking, just kind of watch, right? It's time for me to shut up, which I don't do that well. I know. He's told me that my whole career, I need to stop talking. So, but then he asked me to come here. So
yeah, it works out today, right?
Today's working out. So I'm getting all my words in as much as I can. But it was so relieving to see the number of people that would stand in line for 20, 30, 50 minutes because they want to tell him, hey, I can relate to this part of your story. I can relate to that part of your story. Many of the people that we would speak to would find themselves finding so much more commonality, but you could also kind of see the mental conflict that some of them had because they're realizing, I almost feel bad that I have commonality with this guy who's been arrested for a robbery. And now they have in their mind that they're not supposed to associate with these types of people. Yeah. And it's interesting to see people recognize those barriers, process them, but then have the courage to stand there and talk to him. And he's always been so welcoming. And he would hug people. He's a very affectionate young man. Yeah. And just really let them know it's okay to talk about it. And I think that that's empowering to people to show that level of confidence that you can have regardless of what you might think others are judging you for. So he's done really well with that.
So, he's been able to then kind of take what you did for him, it sounds like, and pay it forward to others as well.
He really has. His biggest thing when we had conversations, because it was really kind of a funny thing if you rewind the tape way back to Goodwill.
Yeah.
What we were doing at the time was very organic. And then what it turned into when people heard about the story was, well, hold on. There are all these different optics that people had. Some people were looking at the optics of, an individual who was arrested for robbery and they're dealing with a police officer. Some people were looking at it from the race optics. Some people were looking at it from the socioeconomic optics. And so as time evolved and more people thought, well, this is a pretty cool story over here in Avon. Let's talk about it. Let's learn more about it. I was a little protective of him because I didn't really want him to live in a world where we're going to force him into rooms and talk about things that were very hard for him.
Felt exploited.
Very much so. That was my biggest concern with him.
Yeah, I can see that.
We found a healthy balance between doing that.
Sure.
And he's always been able to rise to the challenge. He's had a really good opportunity everywhere we have gone. And every time we've had an invite, we'd always predicate it with, if you're ready and willing to do this, this is another opportunity. And so he's
But
really
you decide.
Absolutely, absolutely. Empower him to make that decision.
Sure.
And let him know that I'm not going to be disappointed if you say no. I'm not going to be excited if you say yes. I just want to still be supportive of you because it's still very much a road forward for him to basically rebuilding his life.
Yeah.
Trying to put that in the past, but also reflecting on that in a positive way.
So I have on the screen here your cover on the Avon magazine, so we thank them for allowing us to use that today. And then another piece out of there that I found where you guys, I think you were doing an interview here, weren't you?
Yes.
In the restaurant?
Yep. This right here is at Cheddar's in Avon. We had gone into the restaurant. They were very gracious hosts. This is a clip from CBS National News.
Okay.
So what had happened is Indianapolis News Network had ran the story, and then an individual that I'd worked with and a lot of media from Avon PD had a protege that was working with NBC at the national level. And so they came out and talked to both of us, and a lot of lights, a lot of people and stuff. So it was a little weird. It looks a little organic in this photograph, but I can assure you it was anything else but that.
Sure.
And so, I mean, obviously, having some good communication with the staff members there was awesome. And that's the story that actually reached out to Baton Rouge when they saw the story the next day, and they said, hey, we want to talk to you guys about coming down. So it also opened up more of those opportunities.
Then you got featured, obviously, in the magazine too. So kind of the same story there.
Very
just
much
being able to tell your story through a different platform.
Absolutely. A little bit more intimate sort of a dialogue in the magazine. Obviously, he had his Midwestern HVAC uniform on that day.
Okay.
Came from work that day and actually did that segment, so it was kind of fun. And they said, you know what, keep it on. This is a perfect illustration. And so I think I'm a little slimmer in that picture than what I am on the camera today.
Well, it looks to me like that's the same park you also sang Justin Timberlake's music when you did the lip dub, right? Is that right?
Let's move on to the next topic. That's right.
Awesome. Well, that's a great story. I appreciate you sharing. I think there's really a lot for everybody to gain from that one.
Absolutely.
For sure.
I appreciate the opportunity.
So the next piece I kind of wanted to talk about was a cold case that you have, and this goes back a handful of years. And I know there's been a lot of challenges that you've faced, but I think the story is so applicable to what we talk about here in context because you just had everything going on at once. And I guess my overall question is, kind of walk us through this scenario and what happened, but I'm interested to hear how your chief, Sean Stoops, the whole leadership team were able to keep all the balls in the air, if you will, on this thing and just try and make sure everyone was balanced throughout. So can you kind of just start out with kind of walking us through the case?
Yeah, so it'll be 5 years, believe it or not, this year, in March, essentially. What we had a report of a missing mother. We had a mother that did not show up to pick up her children from school, and that report actually came in on a Friday. The thing about it was the family members that called this in actually lived in Indianapolis. So just across into Marion County, they make that phone call to a different law enforcement agency, but we're not notified until the following Monday morning. So right out the gate, a little bit behind the curve on figuring a few things out. And we learned once we had the case that they had not had any communication with this young woman throughout the weekend. So we were a little late getting the case. When we did, we're processing that, we're triaging that, if you would, as far as where does that fall on a priority for our case. And it was obviously a pretty high priority when you have a mother that's unaccounted for, you know, children not being picked up. And
that was pretty unusual for her, if I remember correctly.
It really was. Yeah. I mean, she had lived in Avon for several years. Her kids had been in the school corporation for quite some time. And so right out the gate, you just really kind of had that sixth sense that really just kind of laid on you, and you thought, you know, something doesn't seem right, doesn't feel right. And so as a team, when we first received that complaint, we were kind of alarmed, to say the least.
Sure.
You know, now we would have dozens of cases where you have a missing person and something pops up, right? And it's like, oh, they didn't want to be found that weekend or whatever. You know, those sort of things do happen. But it took a very dark turn very quick. We had found ourselves appealing to social media, trying to get people to provide tips and information if they had any communication with her. And over the course of about 2 weeks, we've had the grim discovery of locating partial human remains.
Okay.
We did confirm that those were, in fact, of our missing person. Her name was Naja. And so it was done pretty quick that we realized we had quite the case on our hands there. And so pretty small staff compared to where we're at today. At the time, we had 3 detectives and a deputy chief, myself being that deputy chief. The investigators that we had were good-hearted people. They work hard, they work quickly, they work efficiently. But for us, it was really just trying to understand the magnitude of information that was headed our way.
Sure.
You know, we worked a lot with a lot of different agencies. The media really started to become overwhelming as well. And so it did require, to be honest with you, a pretty unprecedented level of management and decision making that we had to make for our team as we continued to navigate that case. So you're
talking about like the tips coming in, and the I saw this, I heard this, all that, and that was probably just constant, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I think for probably a period of about a month and a half, we'd get a couple of those a day.
Okay.
Where people thought, you know, I heard something or I may have seen something. And a lot of times, and we love the fact that people will chip in and give us information, but a lot of times it's a lot of speculation. You know, I've heard this name or I've heard this. And so it takes time with every tip that comes in. It's an allocation of resources, and it has to be a priority. And I think internally that conversation that we would always have is, well, where is it out on my priority list? Is it up here? Is it down here? Is it up here? Is it down here?
So you got 4 people. You're trying to vet every piece of information that comes in to see which bucket it goes in, relevant or irrelevant, basically you're saying.
Absolutely. And I think for the most part we found ourselves learning a couple of different things because we're working with different agencies and different entities. But you also have to keep in mind in our community, a missing mother who's been dismembered and presumed and later declared to be deceased is not something that happens with our team.
Sure.
We're a much smaller agency. We don't have as many resources, but we're networked well enough to know where we can go get that assistance from. So sometimes for us, our biggest strength was just knowing where we need to ask for help. And that was kind of what guided us on many different steps.
Yeah, so now even today, though, this is still a cold case, correct?
It is. Just in January of this year, 2024, we actually assembled another team of individuals. We actually already briefed the case with that team in early January. We're going to be meeting up again at the end of this month, putting together a more comprehensive cold case group of investigators, some retired individuals, people at different levels, the state level, the federal level, and really try to bring that team together. Just start from the beginning, reevaluate the case. What did we miss? What was there? What did we never ask about? What did we never find? What efforts did we not make? And that takes a great deal of stress off the shoulders of us in some form.
Sure.
But we have to be willing to walk into that situation accepting the notion that we may have made a mistake and we may have overlooked something. And that's a hard thing for some people to do. I know I'm not super easy with that. It's sort of a topic of conversation.
Sure.
Hey, you messed up something. You know, no one likes to hear that. But at the same time, if there's an opportunity to learn from that, I'm all in.
Yeah, so this was pretty unique because you were kind of the point media person for this, and so you're kind of overseeing the investigation.
Yep.
You're the face of the media, and you got quite a bit of activity from the media and attention from this, both locally and nationally. You've got your team of investigators you're managing. You've got this almost like a call center, it sounds like, temporarily that's coming in, and you're trying to balance the needs of your team, the needs of yourself, the needs of this family, this victim's family, as well as the needs of the community, because as you just mentioned, this is something that's not normal in this area, especially something this gruesome. So not only are your officers, your investigators, they don't really have reps or see this as being normal, but then you've got maybe a panicked community. So, as kind of the point person on this, how were you balancing the needs of everyone, including yourself, to make sure that you were being, effective to help everyone?
That's a very tough question to answer, so I'll give it my best shot.
Sure.
And I'll first kind of preface everything with it wasn't easy.
Yeah.
And it's okay to realize whatever your role is as management leadership, it's okay to realize that, hey, I'm getting ready to endure a hardship and I'm getting ready to go into something that maybe I don't know the answers to, or I know I don't know the answers to, right? But I think that what leverages the success that I have ever felt with this case in particular and other things is that I have to know my people.
Yeah.
I have to know what motivates all of my staff, right? I have to know that I have one investigator here that's far more motivated by the motivational side of what's going on. This investigator might be motivated by the personal relationships. This investigator might be motivated differently, and that's okay. It doesn't make one of your employees more valuable than the other, but what it does is it shines a light on your awareness as the supervisor, as the leader, as the manager.
Sure.
But understanding that you have to know which card you're playing. Am I leading today or am I managing today, right?
Yeah.
And keeping people within their roles is a very, very critical part of that process. For us, I had to make sure that before this call ever came in on that Monday morning, that I knew what was going on in the personal lives of our staff.
Yeah.
I had to be aware of the fact that, hey, this individual might be coming into this case today, but they may have just had a personal matter, and I need to be able to help orchestrate what happens in this office to be mindful of that if I want them to find another level of success and efficiency within our organization.
When you're talking about understanding people's thresholds too, like how much each person can handle.
Absolutely.
When you're taking into consideration what they already have going on, which is what we call under the iceberg, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great illustration of what that looks like, and to be completely vulnerable during our conversation today, I would share with you too, one of the investigators that was on the team, I had actually overestimated their ability in times. And I found out a year or so later when we would have some conversations that they were taking upon things that I felt they were okay with. And I found out later that wasn't necessarily the case and that there was some stresses in that.
Yeah.
So I did have some self-reflection and kind of realized that maybe I was a little too hard here, or I pushed a little too hard there. But for the position that I was in, I only can be held to what I know, right?
Sure.
And so that was a very delicate balance to find out. We had officers that had personal plans, they had trips, they had vacations, and some of those things changed a little bit during that time frame. And you have to be willing to say, I respect you as a person, I respect what you have, but I'm making the ask today, not because it's out of luxury, it's out of necessity. And understanding what that looks like. Does go back to managing expectations, right?
Sure.
Our team knows before.
And tell them the why, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's such a good point. The telling people the why, I have found that it really gets them to be an advocate for your system. And if you're thick-skinned enough to where you can tell the why, and someone might say, well, I understand what you're saying the why is, but have you thought about this? And you to have the ability to kind of reflect on that and say, okay, and I might pause a little bit in that conversation, but that's okay. That's a growing moment for me as a leader to understand that
you're allowing that feedback to be part of it. Yeah.
Absolutely, because what is right today may not be right in 6 months, right? And that whole leadership test that we talk about all the time, doing the right thing, right? Well, sometimes the facts and circumstances change. Now the right thing might be different if I just change a couple little pieces of that information.
Sure.
So for me personally, navigating all these different things from a professional standpoint, I was able to do so, and I hope that my peers would say effectively. I believe that I was able to do that largely because of my awareness of others and understanding where they were at in the process. There were days when we would get information, we had to get in the car, we had to drive, we had to, send an email, do another search warrant, and at times, just as it's most important to know when to move quickly, also is as important to know when to slow down. Brevity is sometimes is acceptable, but obviously we have to be very thorough. This is a high stakes sort of a situation, and so the media was a whole other beast, though.
Sure.
To be honest. So.
Yeah, and so lucky for you, though, you had years of experience doing that. How was that different for you, and what did you have any takeaways from this being kind of a nationally high-profile case, coming from a small town, normality, if you will?
I tell you what, it was interesting to say the least. We've had a couple of incidents in our town where larger news publications have reached out. We've had incidents with ESPN and sort of entities that would come in and want to know about something that happened that was associated with an athlete or something. It's a little different. But with this case, it was interesting because the Indianapolis News Network took to it pretty quick. And just to give a little context, the weekend that this report was made, Indianapolis Metro was actually handling a missing baby case, and it was all you would see on TV. They were allocating, and in my opinion, appropriately, they were laser focused on trying to find a 2 or 3 month old baby girl.
Yeah. And
so that's why we didn't really get that phone call till the following Monday. And I don't say that in any sort of a derogatory perspective, but the attention that Naja's case got was a little delayed.
Sure.
But there were so many people whose eyes were upon Indianapolis, and they were hearing about a missing mother. We realized that at times communicating with media is very time sensitive.
Yeah.
What's happening today may not be interesting tomorrow. 3 days from now. So for us, it was about being a good communicator, being responsive to our emails, sending out messages. When a news reporter would come back in with a question, I would have to prioritize. That might be a silly question to us as a team, but it's very important for that information to go out and be clear to other people if we're truly trying to generate some of those tips.
Sure. Now,
it did get to the point with our case, prior to finding the remains, it did get to the point in our case where we found ourselves, thinking, I'm talking to so many people, I've got so many emails, and it was for the first time in my career that we ever said, I think it might be time to do one of those things that we call a press conference, just to try to gather everybody together. Put it out there, one consolidated.
Consistently.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that consistency is important for every reason that you can ever imagine. So
how much time were you taking, or how much time was eaten up for your team by saying the same thing to 100 different people too?
Very much so. And if I have one reporter that's asking this question, I probably have 2 or 3 that are not going to ask it, but they'll need the information later. So it was overwhelming, but at the same time, it was all about being organized.
Sure.
And for me, organization is where my mind has the most clarity. If I walk into a room and things are in the right boxes and everything is squared away, then I know where to find that information, or I know how to organize my work. So for me, I did kind of come from a background of being prepared for that. The media side of life was one portion of what this case had become and what it is to this day. We still get messages quite a bit. What's the status with this case? Obviously, coming up on the 5-year mark here in a month or so. Is going to be another interesting time for us. It's a benchmark, if you would, of where we're at with the case. So a lot of those things, managerially speaking, are very complex processes. So again, when you're prepared for that moment, it helps to kind of mitigate the stresses. But make no mistake about it, when you go home for the last 5 years, you almost kind of harbor a guilt that someone else's mother is not at the table or is not at Christmas. And so, coming from a background, it's a little stressful like that.
Yeah, that would be, and then, knowing that you get up every day and you still don't have any answers, like what's that been like for you to cope with, but yet keep the team motivated to, keep going? Because like you said, you got a big date coming up here soon, and you got, sounds like kind of a new task force, if you will, created to really try and dive in on this. So you're still kind of the point person on it. What's that look like for you moving forward now?
For us, at the time that the incident took place, we had 4 of us. We had 3 investigators and myself. And just in the 5 years that's transitioned, that team has actually doubled between our number of investigators, our intelligence analyst, our CSI, and some other detectives that have come into the group. So we have a lot more resources today than what we had even 5 years ago. But navigating that has been a very challenging task. We have a case where we don't have a lot of information coming in, but we just had an armed robbery today, so you have to kind of put it on pause, push your resources over here.
You still have the flow
that radio
of work
keeps going.
Coming in.
So it is very stressful, for the team itself. Now, what is so rewarding, I guess maybe the right word, is that these new team members that have come into the group have been asking us, hey, can we talk a little bit about this nausea case? Can we talk a little bit about where that's at? If I were to get a phone call today and had a tip come in, would I be able to speak intelligently or know where this might fit in? And so as we were growing,
which is important for them, right? Because now they're in that case, but they don't have the historical experience that everyone else has.
So we really worked on that. And yeah, we would brief a little bit during a lunch break or whatever, but I think the realization that we had was we had to be very intentional. And I think at times we forget the intentionality of our actions. We start to forget, well, they know about the case, so surely they saw the press conference. But no matter what skill set you have, from my perspective, but if I don't show you the job, if I'm not intentional in making sure that you understand from first step to last step what that looks like, can I really have a reasonable expectation that you're going to succeed?
Sure.
Or do I need to find time to slow things down, to change the temperature in the room, if you would, and give you the right environment to absorb that, so now I can push you out the door and say, hey, go get them now.
So meet them where they're at, you're saying?
Meet them where you're at. That's one of the biggest failures I feel like we have, especially in law enforcement, is we realize we expect people to acquiesce or to come to us. We have to meet those people, much like we have in other ways in our department. But in this case in particular, meeting where they're at is also transitive, if you would, to our own staff members. Where was our detectives at prior to this call coming in? And establishing that balance at work is one thing, but also understanding that in the home life is a whole other dimension.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that's huge because some people will come and say, hey, I need this, I need that, but many won't. So we can't have that broad brush expectation for everybody. So, no, well, I mean, that's an awesome story. Not an awesome story, but it's great to see how you guys were able to come together as a team and adapt and really say, this is nothing, that we have anything that we can go back and cut and paste and use as a template here.
Right.
So I think that's a big deal, and that's something that we struggle with as the unknown, right? And those things that we just don't have previous experience that we can't go back and grab and use as that template, if you will, for whatever that situation is.
Absolutely. It goes back to what you mentioned earlier about the tools. It's the tools and the resources that we're going to use, and these same tools that we might use to build this shed, we might use those same tools to build a ramp. We might use those ramp to build a home. So whatever they're using is fine. They have to know also when to use those tools.
And how to do it in the right way.
Absolutely.
I agree.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a great discussion, Brian. I appreciate you coming by.
Appreciate it.
If people want to get in contact with you, how can they do that?
Best way, hands down, is through our website. You can go to avonIndiana.gov. You can search in our police department's direct registry. You'll find there our phone numbers, our extensions, as well as our emails. I try to be as responsive as I can to all my emails, so if you go to that website, I can assure you'll find me.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and put that in the comments along with the link to the Avon magazine article and the other pieces on the mentor story. If you like what you see, please go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave us something in the comments letting us know your thoughts about today's video. Awesome. Thanks again for coming up, Brian.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. We'll see you next time.